Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into an absolute alchemical trinity. We're looking at the explosive chemistry of rock music's first and arguably greatest supergroup, Cream. Let's explore exactly how three fiercely talented guys collided to forge a sound that was, honestly, completely unprecedented. It's a pretty fascinating question, right? How did just three musicians change rock music forever in what was essentially just a few fleeting years? Well, the answer isn't just raw talent. It's this incredibly volatile mix of that talent, just sheer, overwhelming volume, and a totally fearless dedication to live improvisation. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the birth of a supergroup, move into their theoretical framework, explore the virtuoso trinity, break down the art of improvisation, and finally look at Cream's enduring legacy.
Section 1, Birth of a Supergroup.
So contextualizing Cream is absolutely vital here, because they didn't just appear out of nowhere. Back in the post-war 1950s, you had British youth pushing back against conservatism by totally obsessing over American rhythm and blues. Fast forward to the mid-60s, and these kids, they weren't just fans anymore. They had basically become musical scholars. In bands like the Yardbirds, they were actively dissecting the literal DNA of the blues, which directly paved the way for Cream to form in the late 60s. You know, the media immediately slapped these supergroup label on them, but honestly, that was mostly just clever marketing. At their core, they were a true alchemical fusion of distinct, formidable talents. This was an ambitious and really volatile experiment, pushing the absolute limits of what an electric guitar, bass, and drum kit could do together. Section 2. The Theoretical Framework. Okay, so let's pop the hood and look at the actual blueprint of their musical engine. Now, traditional blues relies pretty heavily on a predictable 12-bar progression, right? But Cream, they essentially hijacked advanced jazz theory, specifically something called modal interchange. By borrowing chords from parallel modes like Dorian and Mixolydian, they injected this sophisticated jazz coloration straight into the heart of a heavy, heavy blues foundation. And this harmonic expansion basically meant they threw the basic blues rulebook out the window. They were using extended chords, chromatic alterations, and Jack Bruce wasn't just sitting there holding down the root notes. He was playing these hyperactive counterpuntal bass lines that essentially acted like a second lead melody. All of this freed them up to take their solos into entirely unpredictable, expansive territories, instead of just resolving where a standard blues track typically would. Rhythmically, they were just as complex, completely driven by polyrhythms. Actually, drummer Ginger Baker completely despised being called a rock drummer. He brought deep jazz and African drumming traditions to the table. By layering these intricate, conflicting rhythms on top of each other, he created a dense, compelling texture that was literally unheard of in 1960s rock. And, of course, we absolutely have to talk about the sheer volume. It wasn't just loud for the sake of being loud, it was deliberate. It was early sound design. They ran Stratocasters and Les Pauls through these towering Marshall amps to get that searing sustain and controlled feedback. In fact, they played so loud on stage they often couldn't even hear each other. Throw in Jack Bruce's bass swirling through Leslie speakers, and the end result was just physically overwhelming. Section 3. The Virtuoso Trinity. Now, what's really interesting here is how their wildly clashing backgrounds somehow locked together flawlessly. You've got Eric Clapton bringing this intense, searing blues emotion and signature string bending, then Jack Bruce, coming from jazz and folk, treating the bass like a lead instrument and acting as the band's harmonic architect, and finally Ginger Baker laying down that dynamic, polyrhythmic African and jazz foundation. When you lock those three entirely different perspectives together, you get an unstoppable sonic engine. But behind all that virtuosity, the backstage dynamic was famously chaotic. This was a band fueled by massive egos and intense creative friction. Bruce and Baker were actually known to actively sabotage each other on stage, which stemmed from bad blood in their previous bands together. It was incredibly volatile. But the irony is that exact, almost dangerous friction is exactly what fueled the explosive energy of their music. Section 4. The Art of Improvisation. So, how did all this advanced theory and massive ego clashing actually play out on stage? Well, the extended jam was their ultimate playground. They'd kick things off with a familiar blues theme, but then rapidly abandon it for these massive boundary-pushing individual solos. They'd get into this almost telepathic call-and-response interplay, pushing each other higher and higher before finally bringing it all crashing back together to release the musical tension. They were literally deconstructing and reconstructing music in real time. And this created a fascinating contrast between their studio albums and their live shows. In the studio, working with the legendary producer Tom Dowd on records like Disraeli Gears, they were meticulous. They captured these incredibly tight bursts of creativity. But live? That was a completely different beast. Live, it was all about sprawling, unpredictable sonic explorations and overwhelming volume that brought the audience to a place of pure, visceral catharsis. There's actually a deep philosophical nuance here, too. In an era where pop music was getting increasingly formulaic, their improvisation was a deliberate rejection of rigid structures. This wasn't just them showing off how fast they could play, it was a bold embrace of spontaneous artistic freedom. It was basically a musical metaphor for navigating the unknowns of life and finding absolute authenticity right there in the moment. Section 5. Cream's Enduring Legacy. 3. Just 3 instruments. Even though the band was incredibly short-lived, Cream essentially pioneered the power trio format. They proved to the whole world that a simple lineup, just guitar, bass, and drums, could sound as massive, as heavy, and as complex as a full orchestra. By solidifying that power trio blueprint, they laid the direct groundwork for hard rock, heavy metal, and progressive rock. They elevated the blues from a traditional format into a vehicle for high art, complex improvisation. They inspired an entire generation of guitarists to push the absolute limits of their instruments, and they forever proved that a live rock concert could be a dynamic, constantly evolving artistic event. Of course, you really cannot separate the art from the artists here. The human drama, the massive egos, and the creative friction that eventually tore the band apart after just over 2 years, well, they're as legendary as the music itself. That backstage volatility and their personal struggles form a really crucial part of the cultural history of rock music, absolutely cementing their mythical status. Which leaves us with this final thought. If true, genre-reshaping artistic magic requires such uncompromising raw performance and intense, volatile friction. Could a band like Cream even exist in today's highly polished, meticulously produced music industry? It's definitely something to think about the next time you put on a record. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.